It was the single most embarrassing radio call in the history of the Vietnam War. In March 1968, a veteran U.S. Green Beret captain stood on an airstrip at Nui that and openly laughed at his allies. He watched a team of Australian SAS soldiers taking hacksaws to their rifles, literally sawing off the barrels of high-precision military weapons in a dusty garage. To the Americans who prided themselves on firepower and technology, it looked like insanity. The captain turned to his men and said, "Look at those idiots. They won't last a week." He was wrong, dead wrong, because just 6 hours later that same American captain wasn't laughing. He was pinned down in a jungle ambush, surrounded by the Viet Cong screaming into his handset for help, and the only people coming to save him were the idiots with the sawed-off guns. But what happened next didn't just save his life. It humiliated the entire American military doctrine and forced the Pentagon to rewrite its manuals. To understand why, we have to go back to the garage where the sawing began. On the 14th of March, 1968, an American intelligence officer stepped off a Huey helicopter at the Australian base in Nui that and immediately covered his nose. The smell was biological, lead, and aggressive. It suggested decomposition, stagnant water, and something his brain could only categorize as advanced human neglect. The officer had spent 18 months in Vietnam. He had visited field hospitals, burning villages, and mass graves. None of those experiences prepared him for what was emanating from the Australian soldiers preparing for patrol 40 meters away. His first assumption was logistics failure. His second was disciplinary action. Surely no professional military would permit soldiers to reach such a state of filth voluntarily. He approached the nearest Australian lieutenant to offer assistance with hygiene supplies. The Australian's response carried an edge that the American would remember for decades. The smell was not failure, it was doctrine, and it was the reason Australian soldiers came home alive, while Americans came home in aluminum boxes. The American demanded explanation. What he received was an education that would shatter everything he understood about the war he had been fighting for 18 months. But the smell was only the first shock. The weapons would disturb him further. The footwear would confuse him entirely. And what happened 6 days later in Long Kong province would produce the most humiliating radio transmission in American Special Operations history. The statistics told the story the Pentagon preferred to suppress. Australian SAS patrols in Phuoc Thi province achieved kill ratios of approximately 1 friendly casualty for every 500 enemy eliminated. American units conducting identical missions in adjacent sectors averaged 1 to 12. The disparity was not marginal. It was catastrophic. It suggested one approach was working while another was failing completely. The Australian approach began with smell. Every American soldier in Vietnam received a standard field hygiene kit: soap, deodorant, shaving cream, toothpaste, insect repellent. The United States Army considered personal cleanliness essential for discipline and morale. Clean soldiers were professional soldiers. This logic had governed American military thinking since the trenches of France in 1917. The Viet Cong had learned to exploit it. Captured enemy fighters confirmed in interrogation after interrogation that American patrols could be detected by smell from over 500 meters away. The chemical signature of American hygiene products was completely alien to the jungle environment. Deodorant created scent trails lingering for hours in humid air. Insect repellent contained compounds detectable at extreme distances. American cigarettes, with their distinctive sweet Virginia tobacco, announced patrol positions to any enemy scout within a kilometer. The Australians had eliminated every marker. 2 weeks before any patrol, SAS troopers stopped using soap entirely. They abandoned deodorant, shaving cream, commercial toothpaste. They switched from American cigarettes to local tobacco or quit entirely. They ate indigenous food including fermented fish sauce that altered body chemistry. By insertion day, they smelled exactly like the jungle itself. Like rot, mud, and vegetable decay. The tactical results were documented in classified reports that American commanders found difficult to process. Viet Cong patrols routinely passed within 2 meters of concealed Australian positions without detecting anything unusual. In one verified incident from November 1967, an enemy fighter actually stepped on an Australian trooper's boot, looked down, registered nothing but jungle debris, and continued walking. The trooper did not move, did not react, did not breathe visibly. The enemy soldier never knew he had placed his foot on a human being who could have ended his life before his next heartbeat. But the smell doctrine was merely the first layer of Australian methodology. The weapons modifications would prove equally disturbing to American ordnance specialists. The American intelligence officer noticed something wrong with the Australian rifles almost immediately. The barrels were too short. The proportions were off. When he examined one closely, he discovered that someone had taken a hacksaw to a precision military weapon and removed approximately 15 centimeters from the barrel. This was not battlefield damage. This was deliberate modification performed in the Australian Armoury. The standard Australian service rifle was the L1A1 self-loading rifle, a variant of the legendary FNFAL. Well, it was one of the finest battle rifles ever manufactured, accurate to 400 meters, reliable in adverse conditions, respected by militaries worldwide. American ordnance officers considered it roughly equivalent to their own M14. The Australians were destroying it. Or so it appeared. They cut the barrel short. They removed the flash suppressors. They welded crude forward grips made from scrap metal, or carved hardwood. The resulting weapon looked like something a desperate partisan might assemble in an occupied country, not standard equipment for elite special operations soldiers. American weapons specialists who examined these modifications were appalled. They had ruined the ballistics and they had reduced effective range by at least 60%. They had created something loud, inaccurate, and unprofessional. The Australians called it the bitch. And it was perfectly designed for the environment where it would actually be used. In the Vietnamese jungle, average visibility was between 10 and 15 meters. Not 100 meters, not 400 meters, 15 meters. A rifle accurate to 400 meters was useless when you could not see past 15. Worse, the full-length barrel constantly snagged on vines, bamboo, and undergrowth. Every snag required stopping, freeing the weapon, and resuming movement. Every stop created noise. Every noise could mean detection. The bitch slid through vegetation like a snake. The shortened barrel eliminated snags. The loss of long-range accuracy was irrelevant because there was no long range and the 7-round even from a shortened barrel delivered stopping power. The American 5M16 could not match. The M16 fired a smaller, faster round designed for accuracy at extended ranges in the jungle. At 15 meters, it had a tendency to wound rather than stop. The round passed through human tissue so quickly that fighters sometimes continued advancing for several seconds before realizing they had been fatally hit. The 7.62 round from the bitch did not wound at close range. It devastated. It could punch through the thick bamboo trunks that Viet Cong fighters use for cover. It could, in close quarters engagement with a single shot. American ordnance officers wrote damning reports about Australian weapons modifications. Those reports were filed alongside recommendations to adopt Australian methods. Both were ignored, but the weapons were only part of the equipment mystery. The footwear confused the American observer even more. Several Australian troopers preparing for the patrol were wearing sandals. Not military boots, sandals. Specifically, sandals made from old automobile tires with straps cut from inner tubes. The American recognized them immediately. They were Ho Chi Minh sandals, standard Viet Cong footwear manufactured throughout North Vietnam and the jungle supply routes. Why were Australian soldiers wearing enemy footwear? The answer revealed a level of tactical sophistication that American doctrine had never contemplated. Tracking was one of the primary methods the Viet Cong used to locate and pursue enemy patrols. Every boot left distinctive impressions. American jungle boots had specific tread patterns recognizable to any experienced tracker. A Viet Cong scout who found American boot prints knew exactly what he was following. He could estimate numbers, direction of travel, and approximate time since passage. The Australians had eliminated this signature as well. By wearing captured Ho Chi Minh sandals, Australian patrols left tracks indistinguishable from the Viet Cong's. A tracker finding these prints would assume he was following friendly forces. He wouldn't raise alarm, wouldn't call for ambush teams. He might even walk directly into the Australian patrol, believing he was meeting comrades. This was not the only counter-tracking technique the Australians employed. They walked in streams when possible, leaving no prints at all. They stepped on roots and rocks rather than soft earth. When crossing muddy areas, the last man in the patrol would brush out tracks using branches. These methods added time and complexity to movement, but they made Australian patrols effectively impossible to follow. The Viet Cong, who had tracked French colonial forces for years, who had tracked South Vietnamese army units with ease, who tracked American patrols almost at will, could not track the Australians. The hunters found themselves unable to locate their prey. But there was something else the American observer noticed about Australian attitudes that confused him on a different level entirely. It concerned how they referred to their enemy. American soldiers in Vietnam used a variety of terms for Viet Cong fighters: Charlie, Victor Slopes. The terminology ranged from neutral military brevity to outright racial contempt. The underlying assumption was consistent: the enemy was inferior, primitive, technologically backwards, to be destroyed through superior American firepower. The Australians called them Mr. Charles. This was not sarcasm or irony, this was genuine respect expressed through formal address. Australian briefings referred to enemy capabilities with careful attention to detail. Enemy tactics were studied rather than dismissed. Enemy successes were analysed for lessons rather than attributed to luck or American error. The Australians did not hate their enemy. They respected him as a dangerous opponent who had been fighting in these jungles for decades and had developed capabilities that deserved serious attention. And this respect had tactical consequences. American patrols often walked into situations believing their technological superiority would carry the day. Australian patrols assumed nothing and prepared for everything. American soldiers sometimes died because they underestimated enemy capability. Australian soldiers survived because they never did. The attitude extended to how the Australians processed intelligence. When interrogating captured enemy fighters, American methods often emphasized intimidation and physical pressure. These approaches sometimes produced information quickly, but that information was frequently unreliable. Prisoners would say anything to make the treatment stop. Australian interrogation prioritized rapport and psychological manipulation. They treated prisoners with a calculated professionalism designed to make cooperation seem like the reasonable choice. They never promised anything they could not deliver. They never threatened anything they were not prepared to execute. The information they gathered was slower to obtain, but far more reliable. This was the foundation. Smell discipline, modified weapons, enemy footwear, professional respect, sophisticated interrogation. Each element contributed to a methodology that produced results American forces could not match. But the single most important difference was movement speed, and this was the element that drove American observers to the edge of professional fury. The United States military believed in speed, aggression, and firepower. These principles had won the Second World War. They had held Korea. They made America the dominant military power on Earth. When American Special Operations units conducted long-range reconnaissance in Vietnam, they moved at 2 to 3 kilometers per day. And this was considered an acceptable balance between caution and urgency. The Australian SAS moved at 100 to 200 meters per hour. When the American intelligence officer first heard this figure, he assumed translation error. 100 meters per hour meant covering 1 kilometer required an entire day. A 5-kilometer mission would take nearly a week. This seemed not merely slow, but operationally absurd. The Australians offered a demonstration. What the American witnessed in 30 minutes destroyed his understanding of infantry movement. For troopers entered jungle terrain 500 meters from the knew that perimeter. The point man took a single step, placing his foot with surgical precision on a route that would support weight without compression or sound. Then the entire patrol froze. Complete stillness, not reduced movement, zero movement. They remained frozen for 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes, the American watched them scanning their surroundings using only their eyes, never turning their heads. He watched them testing the air with subtle nostril movements, reading scent the way a predator reads prey. He watched their fingers make microscopic adjustments on their weapons, preparing for instant action while appearing completely inert. He watched them listening with an intensity that seemed almost predatory, processing every sound the jungle produced. After 4 minutes, another step, another freeze, another 4 minutes of absolute stillness. In 30 minutes, the patrol covered approximately 50 meters. The American stood 15 meters away. He heard nothing. Not a rustle, not a snap, not a footfall. For armed men had moved 50 meters through dense jungle in complete silence. The tactical logic was brutal and irrefutable. American patrols moving at 2 kilometers per day created disturbances detectable from hundreds of meters, snapping branches, rustling leaves, subtle vibrations transmitted through root systems. Viet Cong listening posts were specifically trained to identify these signatures. A single broken twig could compromise an entire operation. At 100 meters per hour, no signature existed. The jungle soundscape recovered completely between movements. Birds kept singing, insects kept droning, monkeys continued their calls. To enemy listening posts, areas where Australians operated sounded perfectly normal. There was nothing to investigate, nothing to report, nothing to ambush. But slow movement provided more than concealment. It transformed Australians from prey into apex predators. Moving at 100 meters per hour, they detected enemy activity long before being detected themselves. Viet Cong patrols moving at normal speeds created exactly the disturbances Australian troopers had trained to recognize. A patrol that had spent 4 hours listening could hear an approaching enemy from extraordinary distances. The hunters became hunted without ever knowing it. This explained the impossible kill ratios. The Australians were not better marksmen or braver soldiers, they were invisible. They struck from positions no enemy expected and disappeared before effective response was possible. The American intelligence officer spent 3 days at Nui that documenting observations. He interviewed Australian personnel, reviewed after-action reports, examined equipment modifications. He observed training sessions where troopers practiced remaining motionless for hours while instructors attempted to detect them from meters away. He watched stalking exercises where pairs hunted each other through scrub, the winner being whoever detected his opponent first. He drafted detailed recommendations that American units immediately adopt Australian methodology. His report included specific protocols for scent elimination, movement discipline, equipment modification, and tracking countermeasures. His report was filed, stamped, and buried. The Pentagon was not interested in lessons suggesting American methods were failing, but the jungle was about to deliver a lesson that could not be filed away. 6 days later, American doctrine would fail so catastrophically that even institutional denial could not obscure the evidence. The 173rd Airborne Brigade was among the most respected American units in Vietnam. The Sky Soldiers had jumped into combat, fought every major engagement, earned a reputation for aggressive competence. When intelligence identified significant enemy activity in Long Son Province, the 173rd drew the mission. The company assigned numbered 118 paratroopers, commanded by a West Point captain on his second Vietnam tour. a Bronze Star recipient, deemed one of the brigade's finest officers. His soldiers were seasoned veterans from countless similar operations. They were equipped with the latest American gear, wore standard uniforms, and followed typical American hygiene standards. They smelled like Americans. They moved like Americans. They were going to fight like Americans. An Australian SAS team was operating independently nearby. For men, led by a sergeant with 3 Vietnam tours, they'd been in the jungle for 6 days, moving at their usual speed, gathering intel on enemy positions. They wore Ho Chi Minh sandals. They carried modified rifles. They hadn't washed in 17 days. The two groups were aware of each other but hadn't coordinated. American and Australian ops ran on separate tracks. The American captain hadn't asked for coordination, seeing no need. His company would handle the mission their way. What he didn't realize was the Australian patrol had already found what his company was looking for. For days of patient movement had brought the Aussies close to a Viet Cong battalion HQ. They'd spent 31 hours hidden in one spot, watching, counting, noting everything. They'd identified over 200 enemy fighters. Mapped out defensive spots. Noted a regimental command visit. Saw ammo distribution, meal prep, guard rotations. They'd reported this intel through Australian channels. Somehow, the info got lost, delayed, or ignored as unconfirmed. The American company walked in blind. They were heading into a reinforced enemy position, 10 times their strength, with no clue. The Viet Cong heard them coming from over 300 meters out. The enemy battalion commander had almost 30 minutes to get ready. The ambush kicked off at 11:47 a.m. A textbook L-shaped kill zone. Enemy troops on 2 converging routes opened fire together with machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. The Viet Cong had studied American movement patterns for years. They knew exactly where choppers would land, exactly which paths patrols would take, exactly how long before artillery arrived. 23 American soldiers went down. In the first 20 seconds, the captain survived because he was in the middle of the formation, not at the front. He immediately followed his training's response. Return fire at identified positions. Call for artillery, request helicopter gunships, set up a defensive perimeter. Everything happened exactly as it should have. Artillery rounds started landing within 8 minutes. Gunships arrived within 15 minutes. The full force of American firepower was aimed at enemy positions. None of it was working. The Viet Cong were in prepared positions, built and hidden over weeks. They'd survived American artillery for years and knew how to endure it. When barrages hit, they stayed low in dugouts designed to withstand near misses. When gunships showed up, they used the jungle canopy for cover and moved via concealed trenches. The Americans couldn't see their enemy, shooting at muzzle flashes and suspected locations, wasting ammo on targets they couldn't confirm. The enemy saw them perfectly. Every few minutes, another American soldier fell to precise fire from unseen positions. By 12:30 p.m., the American company had over 40 casualties. Ammo was getting low. The artillery had churned up hundreds of square meters of jungle without hitting a single confirmed enemy spot. The gunships had used most of their ammo on shadows. The captain realized his company was being systematically destroyed by an enemy his firepower couldn't touch. His artillery was hitting empty jungle. His gunships were strafing phantoms. His infantry was taking losses it couldn't stop or avenge. At 12:51 p.m., the American captain made the most humiliating radio call of his career. He requested help from the Australian SAS patrol he'd refused to coordinate with 6 days earlier. The Australian sergeant leading the patrol got the message and instantly understood its implications. Allied soldiers were being wiped out less than 2 kilometers away. He could hear the battle. He could follow the increasingly desperate radio chatter. He could estimate roughly how long the American company could hold out at current loss rates. Standard Australian doctrine dictated avoiding direct engagement. Jumping into an active firefight went against all their principles. For men against a reinforced battalion was suicide by any normal measure, but men were dying while he listened to their radio calls. The sergeant made his decision in under a minute. His patrol would help. But they'd do it the Australian way. When the American captain learned that Australian reinforcements were heading his way at 100 meters per hour, his reaction was explosive. His men were dying right then. Help was less than 2 kilometers away, and that help seemed to be strolling through the jungle at a pace that would get them there next week. He demanded the Australians speed up. The sergeant refused. He explained briefly that moving faster would lead to detection, and detected reinforcements would just add Australian casualties to the American toll without changing the outcome. The captain would have to hold on with what he had until the Aussies reached a point where they could actually make a difference. The next 93 minutes were the longest of the American captain's military career. What he couldn't see was what the Australians were actually doing. The patrol wasn't moving towards the American position. They were moving into the enemy's, through it, using the firefight's noise for cover, using scent discipline to stay hidden. For Australian soldiers were infiltrating directly into the Viet Cong rear area. The maneuver required absolute mastery of every skill Australian training had instilled. They passed meters from enemy fighters focused entirely on the American target in front of them. They navigated through a battalion-sized engagement without causing any disturbance that might alert the enemy to their presence. They moved in complete silence through foliage that should have made silence impossible. At one point, an enemy fighter moved within arm's reach of the sergeant's position. The Australian stayed frozen as the Viet Cong soldier adjusted his gear, checked his ammo, and returned to his fighting position. The enemy never knew that death had been a single trigger pull away. At 14:27, the Australian patrol reached a position no American tactical planner would have thought possible. They were inside the Viet Cong perimeter, 35 meters from the enemy battalion command post, surrounded by over 200 fighters who had no idea they were there. The sergeant began calling in artillery adjustments. These weren't the wide-area shots that had done nothing for 2 hours. These were precise coordinates for individual targets, accurate to within meters. He could see exactly where the enemy command element was directing the battle. He could see the machine gun nests causing the most American casualties. He could see the ammo dumps, the routes for reinforcements, the planned escape paths. The first adjusted round landed right on the Viet Cong command post. The battalion commander and his staff ceased to exist in one devastating hit. Command and control collapsed instantly. The second adjustment took out a heavy machine gun responsible for about 40% of American casualties. That gun fell silent for good. The third adjustment blocked the main enemy escape route. Viet Cong trying to withdraw were caught in kill zones by artillery that seemed to anticipate their moves. The fourth adjustment destroyed an ammo point that had been supplying the enemy positions. Secondary explosions continued for several minutes. Within 18 minutes, the battle had completely flipped. The force that had been systematically destroying an American company was now being eliminated with surgical precision. Positions invisible to American eyes were targeted with incredible accuracy. Escape routes were sealed before they could be used. Command structure was dismantled before orders could be given. The surviving Viet Cong broke and ran, leaving equipment, wounded, and organization behind. The American company, facing annihilation, was able to regroup and prepare for extraction. The final tally, 34 Americans killed, 51 wounded, out of 118 engaged. Viet Cong losses estimated at 87 killed, with more unknown casualties. The Australian patrol that had infiltrated the enemy lines and called in precision fire from within their territory suffered 0 casualties. The after-action reports were classified. The Aussie patrol that snuck into the enemy zone, calling in strikes from deep inside their territory, had no losses. The reports were all top secret, the highest levels, not for operational security, but for institutional protection. For Aussies, using basic methods, achieved what 118 elite American paratroopers with massive air support couldn't. They hadn't just rescued the US unit. They'd proven, beyond doubt, that US doctrine led to failure, while Australian doctrine delivered success. This wasn't news the Pentagon wanted spreading, but evidence kept piling up, and the most damning proof came from the enemy themselves. Documents seized in late 1968 revealed the Viet Cong had created totally different tactics for fighting Australians versus Americans. For Americans, the guidance stressed predictability and vulnerability. US units used choppers for insertion, creating detectable noise from miles off. American patrols moved at trackable speeds, leaving obvious trails. American soldiers could be smelled from 500 meters. US doctrine favored immediate escalation to heavy fire support, which created patterns that allowed ambush teams to pull back before effective retaliation. The recommended way to engage Americans, aggressive ambush in carefully chosen spots, inflict maximum casualties in the first 30 seconds, withdraw via pre-planned routes before artillery arrives. For Australians, the guidance was completely different. Australian patrols were known to be extremely hard to find. They couldn't be smelled because they'd removed chemical traces. They couldn't be heard because they moved too slowly to make noise. They couldn't be seen because their counter-tracking skills made following them impossible. Their movement was unpredictable. Their patience surpassed anything other Western forces had shown. The recommended approach for Australians: avoidance. Don't engage unless absolutely vital. Don't try an ambush, as Aussies were more likely to spot the trap before walking into it than to fall for it. Don't attempt pursuit, as Aussie counter-tracking made it futile and potentially deadly. If contact was unavoidable, break it off fast and retreat to areas where Aussie patrols weren't active. The documents used a special term for Aussie soldiers, one that wasn't applied to any other Allied troops. Ma Rung, Vietnamese for phantoms of the jungle, jungle ghosts. The term carried almost supernatural weight, beyond ordinary military respect. The Viet Cong weren't just cautious of Aussie forces. They were scared in a way they never were of Americans. This fear had real tactical results. Enemy activity in Pha Quoc Tuy province, where Aussies were concentrated, was consistently lower than in nearby American-controlled sectors. Viet Cong units that aggressively attacked American forces in one area refused to enter Australian territory in the neighboring sector. When they did, their behavior changed completely, becoming defensive and cautious rather than offensive and aggressive. American commanders noticed this difference and demanded explanations. Perhaps the Australians were in less strategically important areas, perhaps they were avoiding contact to keep casualty figures low, perhaps they were faking operational reports to make their sector seem quieter than it was. The captured documents ruled out every alternative explanation. The enemy was explicitly telling its forces to avoid Australian contact because Australians were more dangerous. The Viet Cong were picking their fights, engaging where they had the upper hand and avoiding where they didn't. Against Americans, they had the advantage. Against Australians, they didn't. But why? What caused this fundamental difference? The answer went deeper than tactical technique. It reached roots of knowledge predating European contact with Australia by tens of thousands of years. The Australian SAS had integrated Aboriginal tracking methods into their operational doctrine through generations of collaboration that no other Western military had attempted. Aboriginal Australians had survived in harsh wilderness environments for over 40,000 years. Their accumulated knowledge of stealth, tracking, patient hunting, and environmental awareness represented the longest continuous tradition of such skills anywhere on Earth. This wasn't mysticism or spiritual knowledge. It was intensely practical expertise, refined through brutal evolutionary pressure over 400 centuries. Techniques that worked survived because their practitioners survived. Techniques that failed eliminated their practitioners before they could pass anything on. The result was a body of wilderness knowledge that no modern training program could replicate from scratch. Aboriginal trackers could tell from a footprint not just the direction of travel, but the person's approximate weight, whether they were carrying a load, whether they were injured, how long ago they'd passed, and often whether they were alert or relaxed when they made the track. They could read broken vegetation like literate people read books. They could detect presence through absence, noticing when birds had stopped singing or insects had gone silent in ways that indicated human intrusion. Australian SAS incorporated specific elements from this tradition into their operational methods. The concept of becoming part of the environment, rather than moving through it as an outsider. The practice of reading landscape features for information about recent activity. The discipline of absolute stillness, allowing observation without detection. The patience to sustain focused attention for hours, without the restlessness that Western training struggled to overcome. American military culture had no similar foundation. U.S. doctrine stressed action, speed, and technology overcoming the environment. The idea that patience might outperform aggression, that stillness might outperform movement, that adaptation might outperform force, was philosophically alien to institutions built on fundamentally different assumptions. This cultural gap produced tactical disparities that casualties measured, but statistics alone couldn't explain. American patrols moved fast because American culture valued speed and action. Australian patrols moved slow because their training proved speed was often fatal. Americans maintained hygiene because their culture linked cleanliness with professionalism and discipline. Australians abandoned hygiene because their training showed cleanliness was a detectable liability. Americans used standard gear because doctrine specified it. Australians modified everything because survival mattered more than specifications. The tragedy was that lessons were available for learning. The Australians shared information freely with their American counterparts. Individual Americans recognized the value in Aussie methods and pushed for their adoption. The evidence was overwhelming and accessible to anyone willing to look. But institutions don't change because evidence demands it. They change when the cost of not changing becomes unbearable. For the American military in Vietnam, the cost was spread across thousands of individual casualties rather than concentrated in a single catastrophic event that might have forced immediate reform. Each ambush was a separate incident. Each detected patrol was an individual failure that could be blamed on specific circumstances, not systematic flaws. The pattern was only visible in aggregate statistics that senior commanders had professional reasons not to look at closely. So the war went on. American patrols continued moving at detectable speeds. American soldiers continued smelling like targets. American doctrine continued prioritizing firepower over patience and technology over adaptation. The casualties kept mounting. But there was another aspect to this story that tactical analysis tended to miss. The Australian methods that produced such remarkable survival rates came at a cost measured in different currencies: psychological, moral, the price of becoming what the jungle demanded. Operating at 100 meters per hour for weeks in enemy territory required a transformation that left permanent marks on those who underwent it. The constant hypervigilance couldn't be maintained without consequences. The total suppression of normal human impulses created patterns that didn't revert when the mission ended. The necessity of becoming truly invisible, rather than just cautious, demanded psychological changes that went far beyond tactical adaptation. Some veterans describe the experience as becoming animal, not metaphorically savage, but literally shedding human thought patterns that interfered with survival. Human minds generate constant internal noise, plans, anxieties, memories, anticipations. This noise is invisible to us because it's so constant, but it shapes behavior in ways that skilled observers can detect. A person thinking about tomorrow moves differently than someone existing entirely in the present moment. The Australians learned to eliminate this noise completely, to exist in a state of pure sensory awareness for days, without the normal operations of human consciousness. to perceive without interpreting, to observe without planning, to respond without deliberating. This state was tactically invaluable. It made them invisible in ways that physical concealment alone couldn't achieve. An enemy scout might look directly at a hidden Australian position and see nothing unusual, because the Australian in that position wasn't emitting any behavioral signals for the scout to detect. But this state wasn't something that could be switched off like a light when the patrol ended. Veterans reported difficulties readjusting to civilian life that went beyond what standard post-traumatic stress models would predict. Inability to tolerate the noise and chaos of normal environments. Persistent hypervigilance for years and decades after service ended. Struggles with relationships, because the emotional openness required for them was precisely what they had trained themselves to suppress. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. But ghosts are creatures caught between worlds, neither fully present in one realm nor able to return to another. The Australians who mastered jungle warfare found themselves similarly suspended, not fully present in the civilian world they returned to, nor able to forget the jungle world they had inhabited. Some never fully found their way back. This was the price of effectiveness that no statistical analysis could capture. The Australian methods worked. The survival rates proved it beyond any doubt. But survival wasn't the same as returning whole. Coming home alive wasn't the same as coming home unchanged. The moral dimensions added further complexity to any assessment. A close-range elimination in jungle conditions didn't fit the neat legal categories military lawyers preferred. When an Australian patrol detected enemy fighters and moved into ambush position, the ensuing engagement often ended in seconds. There was no chance for surrender, no practical way to distinguish combatants from non-combatants in the chaos of close-quarters contact. The doctrine was designed to eliminate threats completely, before those threats could respond effectively. This wasn't the warfare the Geneva Conventions had envisioned. For close combat situations, the strategy was meant to take out threats before they could even react. This wasn't the kind of fighting the Geneva Conventions had in mind, but it was the warfare the jungle demanded. There were also techniques that occupied gray areas between legitimate military operations and what critics might call terrorism, psychological warfare methods designed to maximize fear amongst enemy forces, display of enemy casualties in ways calculated to break morale amongst survivors, interrogation approaches that prioritized immediate tactical intelligence over legal niceties. These methods worked. They undoubtedly saved Australian lives that would otherwise have been lost. They contributed to the fear that made the Viet Cong avoid Australian contact. They were also methods that looked problematic in peacetime reports and rarely survived civilian scrutiny. Some veterans struggled with these memories for decades, not because they believed they had done wrong in any tactical or military sense, but because they had experienced things that existed outside the moral frameworks they had been raised with. The jungle had its own morality. It rewarded what worked and punished what did not. That morality was not always compatible with the morality of the civilization these soldiers came from. This is the part of the story that heroic narratives typically omit. The Ma Rung were extraordinarily effective. Their methods represented genuine advances in the art of unconventional warfare, but that effectiveness was purchased at prices extending far beyond military casualties. It cost something to become what the jungle required, and that cost was paid in currencies that accumulated over lifetimes. None of this diminishes the tactical accomplishments or the courage required to execute missions that pushed human capabilities past normal limits, but it adds necessary complexity to accounts that might otherwise reduce the story to simple triumphalism. The legacy of Australian methods extends to the present day, though often without proper attribution to those who pioneered them. When the United States military finally began serious reform of its special operations capabilities in the 1980s, the reforms incorporated principles that Australians had demonstrated effective decades earlier. Emphasis on small unit tactics and individual operator judgment, prioritization of stealth and patience over firepower and aggression, understanding that cultural adaptation and environmental integration could achieve results that technology alone could not deliver. One of the most decorated American officers of the Vietnam era praised Australian methods extensively in his post-war writings and public statements. He noted that techniques he had observed Australians using successfully in 1969 did not become standard American practice until decades later. By some estimates, the delay in adopting these lessons contributed to casualties that better methods might have prevented. The modern American special operations community owes a significant debt to Australian pioneers who proved what was possible in the jungles of Vietnam. Delta Force, the expanded SEAL teams, the entire apparatus of American unconventional warfare incorporates lessons that were available for learning in 1967. The methods were there. The evidence was overwhelming. The Australians were willing to teach. The institutions were not willing to learn. The American captain who made that desperate radio call in Long Can survived the war. He spent his remaining months in country, seeking out Australian personnel, asking questions, observing training, trying to understand what had happened that day and why his doctrine had failed so completely. He learned that his company had walked into that ambush smelling like a department store. He learned that his patrol speed had announced his presence to every enemy listening post within a kilometer. He learned that every assumption underlying his tactical approach had been wrong for the environment where he was operating. He also learned that the men who saved him had been mocked as primitives by American colleagues, that their methods had been dismissed as cowardice or incompetence, that the evidence of their success had been classified and buried because it embarrassed institutions that preferred comfortable failure to uncomfortable learning. He left the army in 1970. He never spoke publicly about what happened in Long Can province. The records remained classified for decades, but he remembered the men who fell because American doctrine put them in positions that Australian doctrine would have avoided, the radio call begging for help from soldiers he had declined to coordinate with, the 93 minutes watching his command disintegrate while help crawled toward him at 100 meters per hour. He remembered the moment when 4 men who smelled like death emerged from the jungle, having walked through an enemy battalion without detection, the moment when artillery that had been useless for hours suddenly began landing with surgical precision on targets he could not see. The moment when he understood that everything he thought he knew about warfare was wrong. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. The Pentagon called their methods primitive. The soldiers who survived Long Can called them something else entirely. They called them the reason they were still alive. 1 Australian casualty for every 500 enemy eliminated. That was not luck, not favorable terrain, not statistical anomaly. That was what happened when soldiers stopped smelling like Americans and started smelling like the jungle. When they stopped moving like Americans and started moving like shadows.